Welcome to the Router Workshop. My name is Terry Nielson, and I'm a former high school shop teacher and a long-term, 6 or 7 years at the Woodcraft store in Atlanta. I'm their primary instructor. Let's talk a little bit first about routing. What is routing? Routing is a subtractive process, and woodworking is a subtractive process. So in most hobbies, in most things that people they work in pottery or they work in jewelry, they're adding things to build things. For us, most of the time we're subtracting material, and we don't add until we start to put our projects together. But in the process of routing is wholly a subtractive process. We're always removing and wasting away material. And you waste that material in order to decorate, in order to do joinery, in order to shape things. So we're shaping, we're joining, we're decorating, all with the router. There isn't any woodworking tool that's as versatile as a router. A router has literally thousands of different bits available and hundreds of different jigs and fixtures and hundreds of different jigs and fixtures that you can build yourself to make that router more useful. So maybe we're plunging a mortise. Maybe we're fluting a column on a lathe. Maybe we're doing a tongue and groove bit for a door. Maybe we're raising a panel for a door. Maybe we're plunging holes so we can do the holes in the side of a cabinet for shelves. But a lot of times it's just something as simple as an edge profile. So most of us, that edge profiling is the primary use of our router. Before we get too far into routing, I'm going to talk about safety. So you can see from the slide that's up on the screen that that injury where the person lost the end of his fingers in the router, that injury was caused by kickback. And I think that he was routing something as big as 2x lumber with a pattern on top of it, which means if he was routing a 1.5 inch tall piece of lumber with a pattern on it, that he was using a very large bit. And so those large bits that are behind a powerful router usually have a lot of torque on them, and that's where we run into problems on the router table especially. Now before we get too far along, I want to give just some general safety rules. First one is, as we all know, that woodworking is an inherently dangerous hobby. And the fact that we could be injured at any time in the shop is very apparent to us. So you always have to think about your safety. Usually, when you make an operation safer, it takes more steps. You're adding feather boards. You're grabbing a push stick. You're doing something to make that. So safety takes time. So what I tell my students in my classes at Woodcraft is take the time. Another thing that I always advise people to do is to rehearse your cut. So sometimes I'll rehearse it with the blade retracted or the bit retracted, because you need to know where your stock is going to begin and where it's going to finish. And if we're going to use multiple push sticks, then we want to make sure that we have that other push stick available and how we're going to reach it. There's usually multiple ways. So I was getting ready to do a chamfer on the edge of a board, and I went over and I tilted the fence on my jointer, and I said, I don't like that. And so then I went over and I tilted the blade on my saw, and I went, I don't like that. So then I went and put a chamfer bit on my router table, and I liked that. So of those three potential operations for putting a chamfer on the edge of a board, I chose the one which gave me the greatest amount of control and exposed me to the least amount of danger. And a lot of times I'll get ready to do an operation, I'll step back and go, and it takes you maybe 10, 15 minutes sometimes with a brad nailer and a couple boards to whip up a jig to make that operation a little bit safer. Listen to your self-talk. When you're telling yourself that maybe I shouldn't do it that way, don't do it that way. Find a different way. You always wear your safety glasses, especially when you're working on a router. You got high-speed bits of material that are flying around. Hearing protection. What OSHA says, if you're going to be exposed to loud noises for extended period of time, so noise levels for a router run from 80 decibels to about 120 decibels, depending on the router and the bit. And so at 80 decibels, you can be exposed for about 120 minutes, about 2 hours. Well, if you're in that 120 decibel range, then you can be exposed for about 15 seconds. So what I do is I wear a pair of shooter's earmuffs, that cut the noise level off above 80 decibels. You should wear a dust mask. Again, routing produces lots of fine dust. Make sure that you always unplug your router or your router table when you're doing anything with the bits. Router bits are very sharp, so make sure that you're protecting yourself from those edges, especially when you're trying to remove a router bit from one of these packages, or you have a router bit storage container and you've got to pull that thing out of there. A lot of times they're stuck pretty good. I always grab a paper towel or a rag of some sort to grab it, because if your hand slips on there, you'll end up with stitches, especially if it's a brand new bit. One of the things that people frequently neglect is their router collets. So what I do is every time that I remove a bit from my router, I remove the collet completely. I don't loosen the collet, take the bit I'm using out, and put a new bit in. I take the collet all the way off, and then I take my little finger and I clean the dust out of the armature where that collet taper has to jam into that armature. And then I take the collet itself and I look at it, and if it is dirty on the inside, then I'll grab a Q-tip and some blade and bit cleaner, and I'll clean that collet out. Shaft on your bit should extend all the way through your collet. Take the bit and put it all the way in, pull it 1/8 of an inch out before you tighten it down. Collet tightens in the router twice. The first thing that tightens in the router is the taper jams into the taper in the armature shaft in the motor. The second thing that happens is the fingers close in around the bit. Well, if the bit is bottomed on your armature, then that taper tightens in the armature shaft, and then the fingers can't close around the bit, and then the bit spins. So most modern routers are soft start routers. So if you are working with routers that aren't soft start routers, then you've got to maintain a firm grip on that router. Make sure that your bit is not in contact with your work or your jig or your fixture when you turn the router on. And allow that router bit to come up to full speed before you engage the workpiece. If you're working with small pieces, make sure that you have some sort of mechanism that allows you to control that workpiece through the bit. Be it a jig, or they make those little small parts holders. I do probably 95% of my routing on a router table. The only time that I use a handheld router is if I can't bring the workpiece to the router. If I can bring the workpiece to the router, it's going to be done on the router table. If you're making molding, so my wife the other day, she asked me if I'd make her a couple of little picture frames. So what I did is I routed a decorative edge on this edge, and I routed a decorative edge on this edge. And then I went to the table saw, and I sawed that piece off, and then I routed a groove in here, and I put that molding in here. And then I put the same profile. So this picture frame is one router bit, it's a beating bit. I would not be working on that small a piece on my router table. If you're working on a piece on your bench top and you're gonna do some profile routing on it, then you've got to make sure that that piece is held solid. You could do that between a couple of bench dogs. You could put that on a router mat. My favorite go-to is two-sided tape. Or if I need that to be raised up a little bit, I'll put a couple little blocks underneath there, and then I'll two-side tape the block to the bench top, and then I'll two-side tape my workpiece to the block. Okay, if the workpiece is too narrow to route safely on the edge, what you want to do is, if I look at this, I'm going to route this here. I'm routing a hinge recess in here. In order to support that router, then I added this piece of material here. Now, as I work on that, I've got a lot more surface area that's going to support your router. Don't use large bits in a handheld router. So maximum length of bit that you want to have in a handheld router is 1.5 inches. And the maximum diameter bit that you want to have in a 1/2 inch router is 2 inches. Just like on a table saw, kickback is dangerous. So it's normally caused when you're using large, heavy bits. Okay, I'm going to show you this short video. First, you're going to notice that the person is having end grain kickback on the router. The second thing you're going to notice is that the router warns him that what he's doing is not safe, and he continues to do it anyway. And then he says, well, and there's a short portion in there that you don't see where he says, I'm going to take this over to my disc sander, and I'm going to sand my piece of lumber a little bit closer to my template so that I'm not taking off quite so much material. Well, he comes back to the table, puts the workpiece on the table, the workpiece kicks back at him. I didn't run this video all the way to the end, but his fingers, I don't believe, contacted the router bit. I think the workpiece itself cut him, but he did end up with a bandaged finger and some injury. And all of it, and he'll even say so in the video, and did say so in the video, was that he didn't listen to his self-talk. The kickback that you saw that in the video is the exact same kickback that will occur almost every time on this workpiece. And it occurs because we've got this big bit and it's coming into that end grain. So what's it wanting to do? It wants to lift and pull that end grain away from the workpiece. So right now I'm going to go to the router table, and we're going to just do a quick demo on how to avoid that end grain kickback. Probably the most important concept to get firm in your mind when working with routers is feed direction. So I would guess that the majority of incidents and mishaps that occur because someone's going in the wrong direction. They're climb cutting when they shouldn't be. So on our router table, our bit is spinning counterclockwise. So we are going to move against that. So our workpiece is going clockwise because our router bit is going counterclockwise. If I would come in here right now and I turn my router on and I touch the end of this, I'll get the exact same kickback that you witnessed in that video. I normally tell my students to start in the middle of the hump, and I have them draw a line on their workpiece. So to do this first part, we used a bottom bearing router bit. So all router bit nomenclature is as if the router bit was being in a handheld router. So when we say top and bottom bearing, it's as if the router bit was in a handheld router. So this is actually a bottom bearing right here. This is a combination bearing bit. I do a lot of this where I will route part of the material and then I'll bring my top bearing up. So my top bearing is going to engage my template, and I flip my workpiece over, and now I'm going to route off the bottom of that template. So now, instead of coming in and lifting that end grain up as my bit is spinning in there counterclockwise. Now we have no tear out, we had no violent kickback. Understanding feed direction is extremely important. Feeding a piece of work, just the way that they've been told over and over and over again on a router table that you always go from right to left. But he's feeding a piece of work from right to left in the wrong direction. We can't think in the terms of right to left when we're working with our router. So in this next little video clip, I'm showing you a football pitching machine. So we feed the football into the machine. The two tires that are spinning in opposite directions are both moving that football in the same direction. So here you got one wheel spinning clockwise, another wheel spinning counterclockwise, and they're both moving the piece of material or the ball in the same direction. So I want you to ingrain this video in your brain, because this is what tells you which way you should feed your work through the workpiece. So if I'm doing let's say I was going to do this mirror frame on my router table. So if I'm doing the inside of this mirror frame, and we'll pretend that this is the pattern bit I'm going to use here. If I'm doing the outside of this mirror frame on my router table, I am moving the bits going counterclockwise, and my material here is going counterclockwise. If this was a football passing machine, which way would I be feeding that football? I would be feeding it this way, right? Because it's going to grab that ball and swing it out that way. So I am always trying to push the football back into the machine. So you look at the rotation of your bit, and your workpiece is the football. You always are trying to push that football back into the tires, into the machine. So if I'm on this side of my bit, I'm going this way. And I would say, well, that's what I've always been taught. That's That's right to left. But now I want to do the inside of this. When I'm on the inside, I'm on the back of the bit. Bit's spinning this way, right? So it's going to want to throw my ball that way. So I always want to push the ball back into the machine. So I'm not going right to left anymore. I'm going left to right. So the only thing you can do is think about which way is that bit spinning and which way is it going to want to send the ball. And whatever way it wants to send the ball, you want to go the other way, okay? The other way I tell people is, let's say that this bit is spinning, okay? And I just take this workpiece and I tap on it. And I tap on it until it contacts the bit. As soon as it contacts the bit, where does it go? Goes that way, okay? I want to go this way. I'm working on this workpiece on my router table. I tap my workpiece. Which way does my workpiece want to go? It's going to go that way. I'm going to feed this way. You never think clockwise or counterclockwise, because this way we go one way, this way we go to the other. So you can't think clockwise, counterclockwise. You can't think left to right, because sometimes we're going left to right, and other times this would be a left to right, and other times we're going right to left. So that rule that everybody's taught you is on the router table, you're going right to left. Or with your handheld router, that you're always going left to right. You go left to right with your handheld router on the outside of a workpiece, but if you were making something that had a hole in it, you're not going left to right anymore. You're going right to left. And in one case you're going clockwise, in the other case you're going counterclockwise. So what you have to ask yourself is, with my handheld router, so in this case we tapped the workpiece to see which way the workpiece was going to go, and then we went the opposite direction because we always want to shove the ball back in the machine. But with our router then, we would say, this is my workpiece, it's stationary. I'm going to tap my router against this workpiece. Once that bit contacts that workpiece, which way is it going to go? Router's going to go that way, or it's going to go that way. Whatever way the router's going to go, if I lightly tap it against my workpiece, we're going the other way. That's an easy rule for figuring out feed direction. So then I'm going to play this video again, and you're going to figure out what this person has done here. Is he's feeding his material like he's always been taught from right to left, but he's between the fence and the bit. And so that bit is trying to launch that ball that direction, so he should be feeding that work this way. Plus, he should never be working by trapping his workpiece between the fence and the bit. So I have seen people that have tried to use their router table as a dimensioning tool. So they'll set the fence 2 inches back from a straight bit, and then they'll try to run that workpiece through there like they're working on a planer. So you can joint with a router, but you don't plane with a router table. Good rule is, unless it's absolutely necessary, keep your workpiece in front of the bit. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to talk about the routers themselves. One router that's very frequently forgotten about or ignored or people are not even aware of. People think there's like 3 sizes of routers. They use a trim router, there's a mid-size router, and there's a big honking router. Well, the reality is there's one more router in our bag of router tricks, and that's what I call the mini router. So this router for me actually gets a lot of use. And this is my Dremel router. And I've got a little slotting bit in here. And what I love about this Dremel router is I've got the bit set up for the thickness of that hinge. So that router, because it's so low torque and low horsepower, I actually, when I do my hinges for small boxes, because it's so easy to control, because I'm not fighting any torque. So I can put that on there. If I have my edge guide on there, I can use my edge guide so that I never hit the back line of my hinge. But I can literally control this router right up to my pencil line all the way around. And when I'm done, all I got to do is clean up anything that's not perfectly straight with a chisel. Now, it would have helped if I had a router mat or something down here to keep that thing from sliding around the table, but I'm right up to my pencil line here. And all I got to do is straighten that edge out with a chisel, and that makes mortising those little hinges really easy with this little mini router. And I bought this base at the hardware store, and they had a previous router base for the Dremel, and it was a little bit hokey. It didn't work very good. you could use it. I could still do what I'm doing here. But this little plunge base that's on here is actually a pretty decent little base. And I can set the depth right here. I've got the depth set, so you could take your hinge and put it in here and set your depth so that you zero it out against the table, and then put your hinge in there, and that raises your depth stop up, and then when you push it down, you've got the thickness of your hinge. Next router I want to talk about is what we used to call a laminate trimmer. So this little Porter Cable 310 used to be the be-all router for small routers, and it's I believe a 4-amp router, and so it's about probably half a horsepower, maybe 3/4. Just like cars, you got to have more horsepower. It's better if it has more horsepower. So, and these were originally designed as laminate trimmers. So everybody had Formica countertops, and you did site installations of Formica, and then you came back with a flush trim bit, and you trimmed the edge of that laminate back with a laminate trimmer. Well, at some point in time, the laminate trimmer, and this little Porter Cable 310 is out of production. It's such a sought-after router. I started looking for one the other day. I found one on eBay for $400. So this is one of my favorite routers. When I do 1/4-inch dovetails with a Porter Cable dovetail jig, then this is the router I'm using in there. I put the Porter Cable bushing in there and a 1/4-inch dovetail bit, and this is so nice to control. Because if you're doing 1/4-inch dovetails, you're probably doing it in 1/4-inch material or slightly bigger or smaller. So that's what I call the original laminate trimmer or trim router. Well, at some point in time, they became the compact router. So now this is a 7-amp router instead of being a 4-amp router. So they've gotten bigger and a little less compact. And you still, I can, with this little router here, this little Porter Cable 310, I can do almost the same thing that I did, but I don't have the visibility that I had with the Dremel router to route that hinge out. But it's still a low torque motor and easy to control on your workpiece. These have almost created their own niche in that it's no longer just a compact trim router or and for some people it's their only router, and so it's gone up in horsepower, it's gone up in weight, and so now it really falls in the category of a small multi-purpose router. One of the problems I see with it is all of them will only take 1/4-inch bits. So my advice to anybody that's routing is to, unless it's absolutely necessary, buy 1/2-inch shank bits. Don't buy 1/4-inch shank bits. And the reason you don't buy 1/4-inch shank bits, first of all, a lot of times you can't get a bit big enough. You want to do a 3/4-inch dado or something with it. You're not going to do it with a trim router or a compact router. And then you don't have as much material to hang on to. So as the size of that bit gets bigger, the torque against that shaft gets greater, and then those bits spin in the collar. So unless I can, sometimes you're going to do an 1/8-inch slot or something like that. The only bit that's available is a 1/4-inch bit. So that's the only time I buy 1/4-inch bits is if I'm working with a bit that doesn't come in a 1/2-inch shank. There is one thing that happens with these routers that I want to talk about, and that is these routers, because they're tall and they're top heavy, and everybody wants to control them with one hand because it feels good. And so there's a particular accident that happens, and I told you, when people come into the store, I like to ask them what happened when they have that big old bandage on their arm. And I've had 2 people that have had this same accident. So they're working with a long straight bit on the edge of a board. They're controlling this router with one hand, and it's top heavy, and so that bit tips in, and as soon as it does, it digs into the side of the material and climbs and does a somersault and whacks them across the fingers of the arm on its way down to the table. So how do you avoid that? What I would do if I had one of these compact routers, first of all, I wouldn't be controlling it with one hand. I'd be controlling it with 2 hands. And the way you control it with 2 hands is to put a compact router base on it. On my little Porter Cable, this base that's on here. So I almost always equip my routers with one of these auxiliary bases, because it gives you so much more control when you have this knob that you can hang on to, and especially if I increase the surface area, if I'm working on here, I'm going to put a block under here, then I don't have that tippiness, because even though I only have, the most of the time all we have is about 40% of the router base in contact with our material. We have more off the work than on the work. So if I have a base that allows me to turn that router and get more of my base onto my material, I have much more stability. And then, you know, we've all done it, where you're working on a nice edge profile on a project you're working on, and you get a tiny bit of tip in. Now you got that little divot in your profile on there, or you got a burn mark. And sanding that burn mark out, now you don't have those nice crisp edges on your profile anymore. So if you have one of these auxiliary bases, then that keeps you from getting that little bit of tip in that ruins the edge of your profile. Okay, next router I'm going to talk about is the mid-size router. So these compact routers run up to about a quarter, 1.25 horse. They're really not made to be continuous duty routers, although some people are putting that little DeWalt in their CNC machines and running them for hours at a time, and they don't last very long. Get into the larger size, so our mid-size routers, they run 1.75 horse, 1.5. We'll say they start at 1.5 and they go up to about 3 horsepower. This is my favorite router right here, this DeWalt 621. Again, I fitted it with a auxiliary base. Plus this router has a square base on it, so this gives me a little more round to give me that constant distance from the bit to the. Otherwise, you have to be careful when you're using it to make sure that you're staying on the nose of the router when you're routing on the inside profile following a template. It also has dust collection, which is really nice, and it has really good depth stop controls, and plus the switch. Everything is right there, so if I want to lock that on. What I want to talk about is mid-size routers. Mid-size routers, 1.75 horse to about 3 horsepower. And this is the workhorse for everybody's shop. So everybody should have a nice mid-size router. I think I have 6 routers. And sometimes you're doing a job where you've got a couple of profiles to do. You might set up 2 routers with 2 different bits and run one and then run the second one. This is a fixed base router. It's actually a good motor for a router table too. This is a good plunge base router. But if I was going to err on the side of anything, it would be to buy a plunge base router, because once you lock the base, you got a fixed base router. The thing with the mid-size router is they have the largest selection of auxiliary accessories. So for this router, I can buy this edge trim, dowel trim, plug trim little fixture. So used to be you put maybe hardwood edging on the edge of a shelf, and then you would try to take your little handheld router and a flush trim bit and trim that edging back to the shelf. Well, with this fixture here, you put a straight bit on and you let your router overhang that edge, and then you just ride the table and trim that edge back. Because when you're trying to trim back even on the router table, you take some hardwood edging and put it on a piece of plywood, and it's proud about a 1/16 of an inch or so, and so you put a flush trim bit in, but you're still trying to handle the tall piece of material through the router table. This is a CRB, I think is the actual name of the company. People make their own. They'll just take a piece of material and put a hole in it, put their straight bit down through, and then you could just ride that piece of material across your bench top and clean up that proud edge. This one here actually has a mortising jig that works kind of like a dowel jig. And both sides expand and contract at the same time, and keep the router centered on the mortise. You can space it out so the mortise can be on one side or the other. But this is a mortising jig that's available for these mid-size routers. These mobile bases like this one right here, but we sell one, it's a Milescraft. And so this is simply an edge guide and mortise guide and expanded router base. This one, the way it keeps centered on a mortise is you've got 2 pins that come down, and you rock the router until a pin contacts both sides, and they have rollers on them, and you mortise that way instead of having a straight guide like the other one. This is a small circle jig for a mid-size router. I suppose you could put a big router on there too if you wanted. Whenever you're putting one of these routers back together and it's got a Sometimes there's a metal pin that sticks out of the side of the router. Sometimes the pin is inside the base. But make sure that you get them aligned properly, because if you don't, they gall the side of your router. Okay, so the next router I want to talk about is the large router. So large router being the big Triton, the big Makita MV12, the grandfather, I wouldn't call it the grandfather, but the big router that I would say that probably 40–50% of people that have a dedicated router in their router table. And if you have a router table, it should have a dedicated router. You shouldn't be trying to take your router out of your router table, put it back in its plunge base, use it, take it back out, put it in its fixed space under the router table. You really ought to dedicate a router to your router table, especially if you have a router lift. Because if you have a router lift, you're going to clamp that router in there. It's not coming back out unless you take the whole thing apart. So this Porter Cable 7518, which is a 4-inch diameter, 3¼ horsepower router, has for many, many years. I'm sad to say, however, that this Porter Cable 7518 is going out of production. So every router lift almost that you buy, when it comes out of the box, so if I look at this assortment of router lifts back here, I have a saw stop router lift, I have a woodpecker router lift, I have a Craig router lift, I have a Jessam router lift. Every one of these router lifts is configured to take this Porter Cable 7518 router, which is no longer going to be available. But these routers are normally relegated to the router table. If you're in a production environment and you have a fixed round over that you're going to do, maybe even on a marble countertop, or you've got a fixed profile that you do all the time, people will buy these routers in, and they'll even buy them 2 or 3 or 4 of them and set them up for their production environment. So these are good production routers. Not something probably I want to take to my workpiece. Now, if I was doing some router planing, everybody's buying live edge slabs and flattening them with a router. So this would be a good router to do that with, because it'll run all day. This motor is a continuous duty motor. Continuous duty means that it's designed to run all day. Won't overheat, won't shut itself off. Now, if you can't get a hold of one of these, the other router that will fit is the Milwaukee 5625. So the Milwaukee 5625, many people do have already in their router lifts because it's been around for a long time. It is a 4 1/8 inch motor, and so it'll fit in most of these router lifts, except for the woodpecker. And it will fit in the woodpecker if you buy a different set of mounting blocks. So there's enough adjustability in the other ones that the Milwaukee will fit, but in the woodpecker you have to buy a different set of router clamping blocks in order to use the Milwaukee 5625. But that's a 3.5 horsepower motor, and it's a variable speed control. But this is a $300 router, and that Milwaukee 5625 is, I've seen it for $369, goes up to $429. So it's a pretty expensive router. And I haven't been able to find motor only. When you buy this for $300, it's because you're just buying the motor because you're going to put it in your router table. It's one of the only routers that's sold motor only. There is a 7519. The 7519 is a little less expensive. It's a single speed router though. It's just 23,000 RPM. So this one goes between 10,000 and 23,000. The other router that is exactly this size, that's $199, is the Portamate. So the Portamate 4-inch, 3¼ horsepower is a clone of this router. It's a 5-speed, and it will fit in all these router lifts. So on these router lift boxes, they're marked for what routers will fit in there. All of them say 7518, some of them say 7518 and Portamate. I want to talk a little bit about router bits. The first rule of router bits is don't buy cheap bits. So I saw a set of bits, and that is 100 bits for $99 from Amazon. So think about that. 100 bits for $99, that's $1 a bit. Well, that's the retail price. So Amazon probably paid $50 for those bits from the vendor. So now we're down to 50 cents a bit. Well, that's the amount that the vendor sold them to the retailer, was 50 cents. But what's their manufacturing cost? So that means the carbide, the bearing, the machining, the labor, the factory overhead, and everything, because they got to make a profit when they sell that to Amazon for 50 cents. So they got $0.25 invested in that bit. Well, how good do you think that carbide and that bearing is? So I've had people say, I can't get the bit to tighten in my collet. Well, then you put a caliper on it, and that 1/4 inch shaft is less than 1/4 inch, and it's never going to tighten on the collet. Or I can't get the bit in my collet, and then you put the caliper on the bit, and you find out it's not a 1/4 inch, it's bigger than 1/4 inch. Or the carbide breaks. Or the first time you try to do the profile on the edge of a nice little jewelry box that you just built, you got burn marks all along the edge because it's dull. Don't buy cheap bits. Don't buy big router bit sets. First of all, you're going to end up with a lot of cheap bits, and you're also going to end up with a lot of bits that you're not going to use. Buy bits as you need them, then you will have the bits that you need, and buy quality bits. So this bit right here, it's solid carbide. It's got a double bearing. It's a templating bit, flush trim bit. It's a spiral bit, it's an upcut bit, and that's a $99 bit, white side. So I buy white side, I buy Freud. Every once in a while I'll buy a specialty bit from Eagle America or Infinity. So there are some good bit suppliers out there, but there's a lot of junk bits out there. Don't buy junk bits. And bits are resharpenable for the most part. All they do, and you can use a diamond card even, just the flat side of the bit. So if you got a fancy profile on the bit, it doesn't matter. Even if you have a profiled bit, the only thing that you're going to sharpen is the flat side of that bit. So I'm going to talk about some great bits to own. Number one is a good rabbiting bit set. So this rabbiting bit set creates rabbit. So you change the size of the bearing, and depending on what bearing is on there, is how deep your rabbit's going to be. And it comes with a little menu of, it tells you this is the rabbit and this is the bearing you're going to use, and you actually can lay the bearing on the template here and get the right size bearing. And they have one bearing, the last bearing in here, turns it into a pattern bit because it's the same size as the bit. That's a bit everybody should own, is a rabbiting bit set. This is a white set. Freud makes one too. There's a little different. Their bearings, instead of coming in a little stack with a shaft on it here, they come in a little cardboard box. Another bit I think that people should own, and I'm going to demonstrate this in a minute or so, and that's a tongue and groove bit. So if you do any kind of shaker doors, rail and style, one bit cuts the groove, the other bit cuts the tongue. This is adjustable. So these pieces of carbide overlap one another, and so as I expand this, I can have a continuous cut. So this will cut from 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. So when I do my woodworking 1 class and my cabinet making class, we do a shaker door. We do a 1/4 inch slot and a 1/4 inch tongue. When I do the woodworking 2 class, which is a shaker table, we do a mortise and tenon on the stretchers for the table to the legs. And we cut the tenon with the 3/8 inch slot bit. I just take this bit, I move the washers that are on top here, I move to inside. So this is a really excellent set of bits to have if you do any kind of door work. This is a Freud set. Costs about $100 for both bits. And my absolute favorite bit to own is this one right here, and that's the lock miter bit. So once you learn how to set up a lock miter bit, you're no longer do you have to worry about edge banding your plywood, because when you put the lock miter, the corners of a cabinet together that's been lock mitered, you have face grain to face grain, and you don't have any of your plywood edges. You can take and make yourself a mantle, a fireplace mantle, have it hollow on the inside so that you can do a hidden fastener to the back simply by lock mitering all the corners. And you can lock miter the ends on, and you can take the piece of wood that you're using for the front of the mantle, cut it off, fold it around the sides, and that grain will match all the way around. So you can build faux beams with these things. One of my pet peeves is when you look at a craftsman home that has a tapered wooden column on the porch, and they've done a lap joint on those tapered columns. When I built the columns for my house, I lock mitered all those corners on those tapered columns, so they were the same width on all 4 sides, and they came together sharp enough that you could cut yourself on the corners. I had to ease the corners. Okay, so those are 3 bits that I think that everybody should have as kind of a bonus bits. But the bits that everybody should have in their arsenal that are their everyday bits are, you should have round over bits for softening corners and rounding over corners. You should have this rabbiting bit set. You should have an OG bit to give you decorative profiles. You should have slotting bits, straight bits. Over time, I probably will replace almost all of my pattern bits and my straight bits with spiral bits. They do so much nicer job. Think about it. You got a shear bit that's shearing that material off as it rotates and pulling it away from your workpiece, compared to a bit like this that's whacking at the edge of it. So when I'm sharpening a bit, I use these little diamond sharpening sticks. So again, what I said was you just have to clean up the flat surface. Depending on how bad the bit is, I can use a 400, a 600, or 1200. If I'm just dressing the bit because I'm doing a job and I've run a lot of linear foot past that bit, come in and just hit it real quick with the 1200. If that bit's gotten a little bit dull, if I needed the 400 because that bit was starting to get chipped and stuff, I probably would send it out for sharpening or throw it away. And these are nice because they taper to a point on the end, so you can get inside. So if I was going to sharpen the edge of that bit, I would just lay that flat on there and work that edge right there. Turn it over. You're not going to remove enough material that you're ever going to worry about getting one side bigger than the other. And you can see when you look at a router bit and it's got that shiny little line on the edge, it's telling you that it's dull. And so you can see whether you're getting rid of that or not. Okay, and then on some of these profile bits, because I have that little point on the inside there, if I had to, that would allow me to get into a tighter space. Now this bit right here, because I've used it so much, is just got a little, I probably should blade and bit cleaner and clean it up and then polish it. That one's sharpening up really nice. Yeah, if you're doing speaker boxes or something like that, then this lock miter bit is just the ticket. And I have some Trend diamond lube that I might drop a drop on there. Typically the way that people do their cope cuts is they'll back their cup cut up, and some people have a sled or something with a handle on it, and when they do their cope cuts, they'll take a backer board and they'll hold the two pieces together and they'll run that across. Now if you get in this situation where the fence is wider than the board that you're routing, it's immediately going to want to pull that board into the bit. So what happens though is as you're coming in here and you're controlling that, before you get to the bearing on the coping bit, this thing's going to start to cut, and then you're going to cut until you get to the bearing. Once you get to the bearing, that's going to maintain your distance for the depth of your cut. But until you get to that bearing, the only thing that's maintaining the depth of cut is how well you're holding on to this piece of material. And so inevitably, your piece of material, as it hits the front edge of that bit, it dives in a little bit. You get ready and you put your door together, you end up with this little bit of a line where the rail meets the stile, because that piece cut a little bit deeper right there until it got to the bearing, and then it pushed itself back out again. So the way you avoid that is with a coping sled. The other thing is I had students in my Woodworking 1 class who have very little woodworking knowledge. So they walk up to a router table, never touched one before in their life. There's a bit there that's spinning 25,000 or 23,000 RPM. They're holding on to two pieces of material like this. They're not holding on to it because they think that if something happens they can let go. So they're not holding on to it. And so inevitably when I went to put their doors together, they were a mess. I finally sled, and we're going to use a coping sled in this class. So as soon as we started using the coping sleds, everybody's doors come out perfect. And I'm not worried, because every time I hear the router start up and I'm in another part of the shop, I have this little twin, that person that's on that router table is doing something that they are not competent to do. With the coping sled, which separates them from the bit, it makes that whole operation a lot safer and a lot easier. And you'll find that when you go to cabinet shops, and maybe they're not the biggest cabinet shop that has a shaper with an auto feeder and all that stuff, but they do some cabinets and some doors, then they're going to use a coping sled. Everybody talks about, putting one wrench on and then squeezing the two together to loosen that nut so you don't bust your knuckles. Well, if you're using an offset wrench, one wrench is over the top of the other. You can't do that. So what I do is I use my fence. So I'll put my fence up there and I just lock my fence down. And then that way I keep from busting my knuckles. Now I have had people that have thought that their collet was bad because they had to use the wrench twice. They loosen the collet and then they start to take it off by hand and it gets tight again. They got to get the wrench. Well, the first time is loosening the collet from the armature, and the second one is loosening the collet from the bit. Okay, so I'll look in there and make sure that that's nice and clean, which it is, and then I'll clean the dust out of the inside of my collet here, and then I'll take this new bit and I'll make sure. See, now this collet is tight enough on here that I can get that shaft all the way through there. So I know that my full shaft is in my collet. And it's not out far enough that it's going to bottom in the bottom of the armature. Another trick I've heard is people will put those little rubber space balls in their router table, and that way if they ever get a bit in too far, it's hitting on that rubber space ball, and then when they tighten it down, it compresses the space ball, so the bit will always get tight. Now I know where that's at, and I already cleaned the dust out of here. I know I've got a full engagement of my router bit. You have to be careful with a router lift and these offset wrenches. If you're not gentle with them, they will gall your insert screw or threads. And so over time they get all munged up. If you look at anybody's router table that's kind of been around for a while, this aluminum is all banged up and nicked. So I'm always really careful when I use that offset wrench that I'm staying off of my router lift. So now what I'm going to do is normally what I do is I'll cut a tongue on here, and then I'll take my caliper and I'll check to make sure that each shoulder is exactly the same. So I'm going to get this about centered for the sake of time. But I got to center it on my lift, or on my coping sled, because the coping sled is going to raise my bit up about 5/16. Okay, so the way you use this particular sled, and I like this about this sled, because I have had sleds that the bottom part of the sled rides against the fence, and then it gets cut. And I'll make sure that my fences are far enough apart that I'm not going to run into my bit. And I'll put this up against the bearing. What I do is I bring the fence up, and then I feel that contact, and then I tighten one end of my fence. So right now, once I tighten that up, I got a little rock in there. So I'll pull this forward until I'm off of the bearing, and then I'll slide that back until it contacts, and then I'll tighten that down. And then I'll check to make sure that I'm riding the bearing and I'm flat on my fence. But you're right about there not being a lot of table in front of the bit, now that you pointed that out. So to set this sled up initially, what you do, you take a piece of the material that you're working on and you set it up and just put your sled flat against that, and then bring this edge guide out until it contacts your fence. Okay, and that will establish our distance from the fence. So now we have a gap on the bottom of our coping sled so that it's going to ride past that bit. So this surface right here is what's guiding our workpiece across the fence. So I have had some fences where this has dived into the slot, and so then you just take some spacers and space this up a little bit. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to back up our cut so that we don't get any chip out on the back edge. And so we want to make sure that this backer piece is flat up against our fence. And then we're going to take our workpiece and we're going to put our workpiece flat up against the fence. So the way you think about this is 1, 2, 3. Guide against the fence, backer board against the fence, workpiece against the fence. Slide this in and tighten these two knobs down. And now that prevents any kind of tip on our workpiece because our workpiece is locked in. Then I tighten these down nice and snug. And what that's going to do is that's going to prevent that workpiece from being pulled into the bit before it hits the bearing. I'm going to practice my cut. What I say, rehearse your cut. Always rehearse your cut. So this router is set right now at its maximum speed of 23,000 RPM. 23,000 RPM is good for any bit up to 1 inch. That bit is over 1 inch thick. That bit is about 1.5 inches. So I should have gone down one step on my speed. So I should have gone from 23 to 19,000. And when I turned it on, I thought, oh, maybe I'm running too fast. Well, almost all bits, when you get them, will have a speed recommendation on them. So this bit right here is a 1/2 inch shank, 3/4 inch diameter bit, and I look right here and it tells me that I can run this bit at 24,000 RPM. And it says if that bit was 1 1/4, I would knock it down to 18,000. If it was 2 1/4, I'd go to 16,000. If it was a 3.5 inch bit, I would go, a 3.5 inch bit, I would not run it at 12,000. I would run it at 10, the lowest speed on my router. My rule of thumb is for each 1/2 inch, you go down because most routers have about 5 speed selections. 1 inch where you run at maximum speed, 1.5 inch you run down 1 notch, 2 inch down another notch, 2.5 inch down another notch, 3 inch down to the bottom. That's a woodpecker. Woodpecker has stopped selling through retail outlets. They're doing their own retailing now, and I happen to know that they have this sled on sale right now for $129. The Craig lift used to be a woodpecker lift, and then a couple of years ago Craig switched over to a new lift, and I think that there wasn't enough margin in there for woodpecker, so then Craig went to a different vendor for their lift. I believe, and this is just an opinion, but with looking at the lifts, that the Craig lift is built by Jessup. Let's talk about router lifts. First of all, I don't think there's such a thing as a bad router lift. So if you look at router lifts and you read all the router lift reviews you can get your hands on, you're always in a 4 to 4.5 range, irregardless of which router lift. So there's a lot of good router lifts out. Good, but different. So let's start with people buy the router razor. Router razor is a packet of hardware that allows you to take your screw on your plunge-based router and turn it into a router lift. There are a number of routers, the Milwaukee 5625, the Hitachi, Makita, Bosch, all make a router that you can just drill a hole in your router table and use the plunge base as a router. Not a very robust router lift, but nonetheless a router lift. So once you get into router lifts that are made to clamp onto your router and drop into your table, then we probably would start with the Jessup makes 2 router lifts. They actually make more than 2 because they have a dedicated lift that goes in their dedicated router table that has just a round router plate in it. But most of us are used to using the 11 3/4 by 9 3/4 router lift. And so that is the industry standard kind of for router plates is 11 3/4 by 9 3/4, unless you get the bench dog that also makes the Rockler router lift, and they take an inch off and they make it 11 3/4 by 8 3/4 instead of 9 3/4, and that way you're locked into their product. So for most of us, if you're going to build your own router table, you will get something like this. This is a template for putting your router lift in a extension table on your table saw. So before I had this saw stop router table, I had put my router lift in my extension table, my laminated extension table, and so I brought this template home from Woodcraft. I think they sell it for $12 or $13. You'd use a 3/8 inch mortising bit, and you go around and make a mortise all the way around, or actually a dado. And then you take your jigsaw and you cut the inside of that out, and you've got a nice little rabbet in there to drop your router in. Or you buy a router table, and a router table most likely will have a hole in it that is 11 3/4 by 9 3/4 with 3/8 inch radius corners on it. And in that you will drop your router lift. So the first lift I want to talk about is I'm going to talk about this Jessup router lift. And so it's Route R lift. And so when you buy the Jessup router lift, it's, I think, under $200, like $169. Now they reinforce the plate with these steel bars because this is not a anodized aluminum plate, it's a phenolic plate. So you'll find these little raised steel bars on here, okay, to keep that plate from warping. The other thing is, if you buy this lift, you have to buy it according to the router you're going to put in it. So this router lift right here is configured for a Porter Cable 7518. So the fact that this will take a 3 horsepower router is a little surprising to me. But it's got lighter weight posts, has a small screw, has a phenolic top, and it's configured for whatever diameter router you're going to put in there. But that's your entry-level Jessup lift, under $200. The next lift that I would talk about is the Jessup Master Lift. The Jessup Master Lift is a anodized aluminum base, very large steel guideposts, very large screw, adjustable for different router sizes. Another thing you want to look at is this has 8 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 leveling screws to level against that rabbet that you put in your router table. So I couldn't get my hands on a master lift. In fact, Jessam themselves, if you go directly to Jessam, is out of stock on master lifts. So, because of the current situation where there's a little glitch in the supply chain for a lot of things. But basically, it's very similar to this Craig lift. Okay, and the difference is that the master lift has bigger posts. It has I think the threaded screw is about the same. These have sealed bushings on there to keep these posts clean. And then they have a selectable hole in the brackets that hold the router, and then you clamp this onto the router, and depending on the hole configuration, this will take any number of routers. It also has a really nice cam lock on it so that you can lock this wheel. The graduations on here, so once you get that fed in, get your router bit in there, you can adjust it in 2/1000 increments, up or down. What's different about the Craig lift, so the Craig lift is $299, so you can get a Craig lift for about $300. Well, it's basically very similar to the Jessam Master Lift. The Jessam Master Lift has 2 sets of holes in these clamping blocks, so it takes more routers. It's also, the clamping blocks are bigger. The posts are bigger. It has 8 leveling screws. This has none. So this is made to drop into a Craig router table. Craig router table has corner brackets. The corner brackets have leveling screws on them. And then after you get it level, you put a securing screw down through the top to screw it in the corners. You could use this in a homemade router table, because it's going to save you 60, 70 bucks to buy it. But you got to figure out some way to level it. You could drill it and tap it, get some set screws and put in there. You could shim it, but it's primarily made to be used with a Craig. And you could buy these Craig corner brackets and put them in your homemade table. But see, these are very similar sized guideposts on here. This has a little more travel than the Craig. Very similar components. The locking mechanism that locks the cam lock on it is about the same. So the next one I want to talk about is the woodpecker. Primarily different about the woodpecker lift. On all of these lifts, and you saw me when I was adjusting the bit on my router table with that crank handle. And if you want to bring the router all the way up or all the way down, and sometimes I'll cut off an Allen wrench and put it in a drill to run that thing up and down. But with the Craig, or the woodpecker lift, it comes with this little handle here. And then you push the handle in this hole right here. And then once you get it all the way down, you give it a quarter of a turn, like that. And once you give it that quarter of a turn, you can run that. It's a little bit hard without a router in there. So I can run that router, and then, so I could do my gross adjustments. I got that router all the way up now, and I just changed my bit, but it's a very tall bit, and I need to get it all the way back down. I push it back down, twist this handle, and it stays there. Then once I get the gross adjustment done, I turn this little thumb wheel right here, and these little increments on here, and this is a very nice woodpecker Incra style, accurately machined 1,007-inch increments, where all these have kind of a, I think it's a metal disc that's in there, but it's 2,000 increments, and it's much less finished looking than this one. But this is each 1,000th of an inch. Where you run into trouble with this is people forget where their handle is, or they don't want to go get it, and they try to run that router all the way up. Well, once you unlock this thing and move it, then this wheel centers itself, and you have a little bit of travel in each direction. So gross adjustments with the handle, fine adjustments with the wheel. Oh, there is a lock on here. Right here is they call it a brake. So if you put the Allen wrench in here and you tighten that set screw down, this has 8 leveling screws. And look at the size of those guideposts, massive. The thing about the woodpecker router lift, though, is you have to put these blocks in. So this set of blocks that came with this router lift are for a Porter Cable 7518. If I wanted to put a Milwaukee 5625 in this one, I would pay $39 for a different set of blocks. So for each different size router that you put in here, you have another. So this is the most expensive lift of the four because it's $400. It's a $399 lift. So it's already the most expensive lift, but if it's not configured for the router you're going to put in it, you got another $39 in guide blocks or clamping blocks. But this is my favorite lift. I used one of these for 5 years before I had to clean these off because it was starting to get sticky. Most of these other ones over time will get sticky. They'll all get sticky over time, but because you're routing resinous wood, and that resinous wood builds up on components. These sealed bushings in here keep these pretty clean, but over time they'll get some buildup. Okay, the last one I would talk about is the saw stop lift. The saw stop is a 4-post lift, chain driven. And so what makes it different than the other lifts is on these lifts you have a screw that turns, that raises and lowers the router on a guide bushing. The way this one works is there are 4 nuts that this chain turns. And when this chain turns those nuts, they turn the nut, and so the nut climbs up and down these screws. As you're routing, and you've got your vacuum on your router box that hangs underneath your router, so that stream of sawdust is being pulled past these posts, and you get buildup on these legs. So if I look at this right here, see the buildup on there? So over time, what happens is this lift gets difficult to raise and lower because these screws do not clean themselves real well. So every once in a while, you got to take the lift out of the router table and clean these posts. So I told you I had an Incra or a Woodpecker PRL in there before I bought this one. I never took that lift out of the table in the 20 years that I owned it. So this one I've had to clean a couple times already. So, but clamping mechanism very similar. What they do though is for different size routers, they provide you a collar to put on your router, and then you drop the collar in there and you clamp it. You clamp the collar into there. $3.99. That's a $3.99.
Does it come with separate collars, or do you have?
It comes with the whole thing. Everything's in the box. You don't have to go out and buy anything separate. You just have to be aware that you got to keep this chain and these posts clean. There's a cam lock right here. And these graduations are in 2007H. Chain. I think there is a tensioner in here. This right here. I think you could slide this over and tension the chain. But there's your cam lock. What happens is it just pushes this little brake up against this wheel. This lift is also leveled from the router table. It's not leveled. There are no leveling. This has 12 or 16 leveling screws underneath there. In the cast iron, it's all pre-threaded. That is anodized aluminum. That's a nice plate. The graduations that are on most of these. So you see, here's the scale right here, so you can see where your fence is in relationship to the center line of the bit. This one doesn't have one. Frequently, I'll go to my router table, and I pretty much know for a specific setup where I'm going to put my fence. Collars are going to center the router in the hole. Yeah, you just have a center line on the crate. You have a center line. This one doesn't. The Jessam does not have. So I kind of like this scale. It's kind of a nice thing to have. The saw stop takes the Jessam inserts. So a lot of the router tables, the Craig, the Woodpecker, they all take the same insert. Now, one of the things that I don't like about the Jessam or the saw stop, because the saw stop takes the Jessam inserts, which could be a clue as to who's building this lift. I'm not sure. But if you buy the saw stop inserts, they come blank and you got to drill your own holes. And they cost more than the entire set of Jessam. But if you buy the entire set of Jessam insert rings, a lot of these lifts, you have to buy that guide bushing insert separate. Jessam gets $10. Well, I wanted I wanted my saw stop to be all saw stop.
Yeah.
So I sold my my extension table. Lasted about 30 seconds on Marketplace once I listed it. I don't have anything bad to say about this lift. I use it all the time. They all come with different wrenches too. Some of them got a piece of bent steel rod, and some of them have the little plastic. Craig is now coming with a little plastic C-clip kind of thing. The saw stop takes the Jessam insert. This one takes the Craig woodpecker insert. Well, that's what I'm saying. To me, there are no bad router lifts. They're all good. They're just all different. And so it's all the features you're looking for. But you know, if you get the most inexpensive lift, which is the router lift, you know, it's got leveling screws. You can put it in any table. You $2.99 for the Craig, but then you got to buy the Craig corners, or use it in a Craig table. You know, the saw stop lift's $3.99, but it's a lot different configuration. It's different than any other lift. They're all 2 guideposts and a screw. This is 4 screws and a chain. Well, I like the woodpecker because I like that spring-loaded rod. Yeah, so I make my own butterflies. You could buy that template kit, but where people get confused is when they're using their templating bit is when do I use the bushing and when do I use the bit without the bushing?